The various arts known to mankind, in spite of the differences of their functions and achievements, are yet all concerned to make money, some earning less, some earning more, and some just enough to live upon. And not only the base mechanic arts, but of the rest, those which are esteemed liberal arts, as well as those which only border upon being liberal. And true philosophy is the only exception. In his climactic speech to the Roman Emperor Domitian, Apollonius of Tyana says that philosophy is the only art that people come to for its own sake. And philosophy is the art that Apollonius has been practicing for his entire life. He is in search of true knowledge, true understanding, and the peace and happiness that come with the acquisition of wisdom. We've been exploring the biography of Apollonius of Tyana, written by Philostratus during the Severan period of the Roman Empire. Last time we covered Apollonius's early life and education, and his travels to the east to study with the sages of India. And as we go through the work, we've been following this thread of philosophy versus tyranny, which is not only one of the main themes of the biography itself, but of philosophy in general. Philosophy puts itself up in contrast with bad rulership, and offers itself as an alternative way, a way to be a good ruler. We ended last time with Apollonius's indirect dealings with the Emperor Nero, who made himself an enemy of philosophy and who banned its practice in the city of Rome. So we'll pick up today right where we left off with Nero's bad behavior. In the second half of the biography, this question of proper versus improper leadership, how to be a good leader, how to judge leaders, whether they are good or bad. This thread will continue and will continue to follow this question of philosophy versus tyranny in the second half of the work. First with the rest of Nero's reign, and then with the Flavian emperors. And as we go through, we'll see where the practice and study of philosophy gives Apollonius and his friends certain advantages, and where the rejection of philosophy hurts those who refuse to practice it. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new, welcome back. My name is Kate, and this is Hearth of Haimonia, where we talk about belief, and especially alternative belief and spirituality in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. If this kind of thing is interesting to you, if you want to get caught up on the previous videos in this series, you can find them linked above and down below, and if you don't want to miss future videos like this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. It helps me out a lot. And so let's get into the second half of the biography of Apollonius of Tyana. This is in particular, I think, going to be a very long video, so I will have timestamps if you want to jump around or take several days to watch this. I understand. I don't know how long it's going to be, but it's going to be a big one, so let's just get right into it. When we left Apollonius, he was traveling west to the Pillars of Hercules, or the Strait of Gibraltar, and Nero was traveling east to Greece. While on the Iberian Peninsula, Apollonius visits a city called Gadeiran, which is modern-day Cadiz, Spain, because he's heard that they have interesting religious customs and he wants to check them out. Apollonius considers himself a very religious person, and he sets himself up a lot of times as a spiritual leader for the community. So he's interested in religion, and he goes to see what the religion of Gadeiran is all about. But when he gets there, he finds a people that are overly concerned with religion. Now, this is coming from a very religious person, but these guys take it to an extreme. to the point where they have far too many shrines, and they even have shrines dedicated to things that Apollonius thinks you shouldn't have shrines to, like death. This is not an opinion that Apollonius invents. A lot of people in antiquity were hesitant to have shrines or temples dedicated to death or gods related to death, I think for obvious reasons. But the people of Gadeiran have a shrine to death, they have a shrine to poverty, and he finds also that they are really into Hercules. This isn't surprising given Hercules' mythology. But the people of Gadeiran, just for good measure, they worship both Heracles of Egypt and Heracles of Thebes. Each one of them has their own temple. And they also have statues set up to famous Athenians. Some of them are not necessarily objects of worship, but some are. So, for example, they have a statue of Themistocles, which they venerate but don't necessarily worship. They just look to him as an inspirational historical figure. But they do make sacrifices to Menestheus, who was the legendary king of Athens during the Trojan War. So not necessarily a real person, maybe a real person, but these people have shrines to everything, and Apollonius is kind of less than impressed. So that is all we learn about the religion of the people of Gadeiran. It's worth mentioning because we've been following these religious threads. Now, although Apollonius goes to Gadeiran specifically to learn about their religious practices, their religion doesn't get much airtime in the story because Nero and his stance towards philosophy, his hostility towards philosophy and wisdom continues to dominate the conversation. We learn early on in Book 5 that Nero has been degrading himself by competing in the Olympic Games and by giving a musical performance there. This is not the behavior of emperors. Emperors have other things to do, and they're not supposed to be competing in musical or athletic competitions. Nero doesn't care, he's going to do it anyway. This has been a theme with Nero where he gives these performances and people are forced to attend and they're forced to applaud. It's all in service of making Nero feel better about himself rather than focusing on the business of running an empire. So Apollonius takes great offense at these kinds of antics. So Apollonius is talking to his friends while they're in Spain, and he talks about Nero. He says, quote, "Well, here is the man himself who wields absolute power, throwing in his lot with actors and artists, cultivating a soft voice, and trembling before the people of Elis or of Delphi, or if he does not tremble, yet misrepresenting his art so thoroughly as not to anticipate he will be whipped by the people over whom he has been set to rule." So again, this is all in service of Nero's ego. And it's not only him that is performing, he is forcing other people to perform as well, which costs money, so he's ruining people's livelihoods, and this is the discussion that Apollonius and his friends are having. And in this discussion, Apollonius reminds everybody that he had made a prediction, which we covered in the last video, about how Nero will cut the Isthmus of Corinth. This is like a big land feature that it was not possible with the technology that was available to cut this isthmus in half, but a lot of rulers had tried to do it as kind of like a show of their access to resources or engineering prowess or whatever it is. So this is a project that a number of rulers have taken on and no one has succeeded. And Apollonius predicted that Nero would try it, and indeed, he does try it. But Apollonius makes another prediction that Nero will not actually complete the cutting of the isthmus because he never finishes anything that he starts, his songs, his performances, anything at all. So why would he finish the cutting of the isthmus? And indeed, he does not manage to finish it. He does not cut through the isthmus. But Nero does meet his end shortly after this. And the account by Damis, who is Apollonius's closest companion, his friend, his follower, who writes an account of his time with Apollonius that Philostratus is using as one of his main sources, Damis says that Apollonius may have actually had a role in getting rid of Nero by supporting one of the revolutionaries during the year of the 4 emperors. So towards the end of Nero's reign, there was a conspiracy led by a guy called, I'm not even kidding, Vindex. It's spelled with a V, but Latin pronunciation. My students always used to love that. Vindex is a senator who rebelled against Nero. And in Philostratus's account, he thinks that Vindex was not really trying to make himself emperor, but was instead trying to overthrow Nero and install a better emperor that would have the Senate's interest in mind in a way that Nero and some of the other Julio-Claudians had not. And so he supports a candidate called Galba. And if you know Roman imperial history, you will have heard that name before, because Galba does, in fact, succeed Nero as the next emperor for a very brief period. So Philostratus says that Vindex turned the people against Nero in a speech, which is something very important for the practice of philosophy, the giving of speeches. A speech which was, quote, inspired by the loftiest sentiments which a man can feel against a tyrant. And that Apollonius himself, quote, all but took up arms himself on behalf of Rome. What this means, I don't know. Philostratus does not elaborate. He's very careful about these kinds of things. He doesn't want to suggest that Apollonius is a traitor against the empire or anything like that. The overthrow of Nero and the subsequent power struggle is generally referred to as the year of 4 emperors. And as the name implied, that is because during that year, 4 people held the throne. So Nero is driven out of the city and ends his own life in the year 68 CE, and Galba, who is the guy that Vindex had been supporting and that maybe Apollonius was supporting, becomes emperor. But there are other claimants to the throne, Otho and Vitellius, who each subsequently overthrow the other and take over. And lastly, there is Vespasian, who defeated the others and became the first Flavian emperor. And we will meet him soon enough. Now, of course, because it's Apollonius predicted that the year of the 4 emperors would happen. Someone asks him who will sit on the throne, and Apollonius says many Thebans will have the throne. Which is a poetic way of saying that many people will hold the throne and will have power, but not for very long. After that, Apollonius correctly interprets a prodigy, where a woman gives birth to a child that has 3 heads, and Apollonius connects the dots and says that these 3 heads represent Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, all of whom will have power, but for a very short period of time. A 3-headed child in antiquity was not expected to live very long. I mean, medicine it was not possible. So he predicts that this means that the 3 of them will take over and become emperor, and then very quickly lose their power. And indeed, that's what happens, and Vespasian becomes the next emperor. But before we meet Vespasian, there are a couple of throwaway lines in Book 5 that need addressing. We've been talking about the advantages and the exceptional status of philosophers, especially of Apollonius as the kind of be-all, end-all philosopher and the hero of the story. And I've said that there is a supernatural or not quite human aspect of Apollonius that other people pick up on during his life. Things happen with Apollonius. Like at the end of Book 4, there is a warrant out for his arrest because Nero is no friend to philosophy, and so philosophers are being arrested. And when the imperial officer comes to Apollonius to deliver the arrest warrant and take him in, all of the charges on the page somehow mysteriously disappear. And the imperial officer takes this to be a sign that Apollonius is not quite normal, not quite human, and he does not arrest him because he's afraid of divine retribution if Apollonius is somehow connected to the gods, or that he might be a daimon that will curse him or something. So this kind of thing follows Apollonius around throughout his life. It shows up in Book 5 in just a couple of throwaway lines that I'll read to you. Apollonius and his followers are traveling by boat. They have boarded one ship and they're just starting to take off, but Apollonius, for whatever reason, decides that he cannot be on this ship anymore, and he goes to another ship. And all of his followers follow him, quote, "For it was an essential part of their philosophic discipline to imitate his every word and action." And in fact, the ship that they were originally on ends up capsizing. So he saved them all. When Apollonius reaches Alexandria, because he's traveling from Spain down into North Africa, where we'll spend part of Book 5 and Book 6, when Apollonius reaches Alexandria, his reputation precedes him. Quote, "They gazed upon him as if he was a god, and made way for him in the alleys, as they would for priests carrying the sacraments." Now, I want to be clear, they are not explicitly worshipping Apollonius as a god, but there is a sense that this is not a normal person, and that the people should respect him almost in the way that they respect the gods. So these are just little throwaway lines, but we will return to this thread over and over again throughout the rest of the biography, so I wanted to put them in here. But let's turn now to Vespasian. Once Nero is gone and the year of 4 emperors is underway, Vespasian comes onto the scene and we learn that he is considering a bid for emperor. Vespasian has been, up to this point, campaigning in Judea, and he wants to ask Apollonius for advice about his bid for emperor, whether he should do it or what he should look out for, things like that. If you'll remember, the way that emperors and leaders are characterized in this text in particular, and in other works of political philosophy, more on that later, the way that they are characterized is that the leaders who are willing to engage with philosophy, who practice philosophy and study it themselves, or at least are willing to listen to those who do so, are considered to be good emperors. And emperors who oppose philosophy, reject it, they are considered bad. So the first thing we learn about Vespasian in this text is that he is seeking out advice from Apollonius of Tyana. So I'll give you a second to guess how Vespasian is characterized. When he's first talking to Apollonius, he says, quote, "O Zeus, may I hold sway over wise men, and wise men hold sway over me." Now, as for Apollonius, we learn that Vespasian had written to him and invited him to Jerusalem to give him some advice, but Apollonius refused to go. So, not giving up, Vespasian said, "All right, well, I will just come to Alexandria to meet with Apollonius where he is at." So, without doing anything in particular, Apollonius has the ability to summon future emperors to him. He says, "You want to talk to me? You come to me." So this shows you what kind of soft power Apollonius has, especially when the rulers are good rulers, although Vespasian is not emperor just yet. So when they first meet, Philostratus says, quote, "After he," meaning Vespasian, "had sacrificed, and before he gave official audiences to the cities, he addressed himself to Apollonius. And as if making a prayer, yes, as if making a prayer, he said to him, quote, 'Do thou make me a king.'" Just a quick aside here for anybody keeping track of these terms. Now, when he says the word king here, first of all, Philostratus is writing in Greek, so the word is basileus. They use this word. It doesn't have the same negative connotation as the Latin word rex does. There was a sense that the Romans didn't want to accept people as their king, so emperors tried to get around that terminology. But because Philostratus is writing in a later time period, and because he is writing in Greek, there's not this negative connotation with that word. So just a little aside about that. So Vespasian comes to Apollonius, asks him to help him seize power, and he explains his motivations for why he would want to be the ruler, because ambition was not necessarily considered a virtue, but Vespasian argues that he is patriotic and he can't sit by while emperors like Nero and now especially Vitellius, who is the last of those other emperors during this year, they're degrading the office of emperor, essentially, and he can't sit by anymore. He believes that the office of emperor should be held by someone who has Roman values and who understands Rome for what it's supposed to be. So this is why he says he wants to take over. The latter part of Book 5 covers the meeting between Apollonius and Vespasian and the subsequent meeting that they have with two of Vespasian's advisors, someone named Dio, that is Dio Chrysostom, who's a real historical person, and Euphrates, who I believe is a fictional character made up for this story, but if I'm wrong, please let me know. That would be really interesting to know. But these are both advisors of Vespasian, and they are both philosophers. Now, at first, Apollonius takes a liking to both of them. He wants to include them in things, but to be clear, Apollonius is far superior to them in every way and is clearly Vespasian's favorite among the three philosophers that he's talking to. So all of these guys get together and they have a meeting, first about how Vespasian should proceed, and second, and maybe more importantly for our purposes, how a ruler should rule, how a leader should lead, what characterizes a good emperor versus a bad emperor, since all they have, it seems to be, are negative examples. Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, Galba, and Vitellius most of all, because he is currently emperor as they're speaking. This debate is one of the mainstays of philosophical instruction, and it gets to the heart of political philosophy. How should a leader lead? And debate in general is one of the primary ways that philosophy is taught and practiced. So a group of people get together, each presents their own ideas. Those arguments are evaluated, and the winning argument basically becomes what people are going to do. Dialogue is the primary delivery mechanism for philosophy. Think about Socrates. What we know about Socrates comes from dialogues written by Plato that describe discussions like the one that we have right here that Socrates was having on a number of topics. We've seen Apollonius do this kind of thing earlier in the text when he has discussions with Phraotes and when he teaches Damis how to think like a philosopher and how to debate like a philosopher. Those conversations were about metaphysical things or just kind of everyday pedestrian topics, but now we have the real meat and potatoes of political philosophy, that is, how should a leader lead? So this meeting that they have is more than just a plot point. You can almost consider it a stock set piece in a work of philosophy. And the dialogue is very straightforward. Each one of the three philosophers presents their own arguments. There is a little bit of discussion, and Vespasian decides how he's going to proceed. Now, from the very beginning, Euphrates harbors jealousy towards Apollonius. He can tell that Apollonius is Vespasian's favorite, and he takes issue with it. So we begin with Euphrates' speech. He says that young men naturally flock to tyranny, but to make oneself a tyrant in old age is more blameworthy. So in other words, you know better because you are older. He also thinks that Vespasian should have been the one to lead the charge against Nero, not Vindex, because Vespasian had access to all of the army that was fighting in Jerusalem. He thinks that they shouldn't have been wasting their time persecuting Jews when they could be defending their homeland against tyranny. He then says that because the Romans love their institutions, You, Vespasian, should abolish the monarchy, this system of empire that is effectively a monarchy, and restore a popular government and freedom. So in other words, he's arguing for a restoration of the Roman Republic, a return to democracy, that style of governance. Now, Dio Chrysostom gives his perspective, and he agrees with Euphrates that Vespasian should have gone after Nero rather than the Jews, and he likes the idea of democracy even if he thinks it's inferior to aristocracy. But he worries that the people have been under tyranny for so long that they may not even conceive of themselves as free people at all. So this would be a problem of democracy if the people are not accustomed to ruling themselves. They may not understand what that entails or how to pull that off, what the responsibilities of an individual person in a democracy are. He says, no matter what, Vitellius should be defeated, but then, once Vespasian comes into power, he should put the choice to the people. And if they choose democracy, then Vespasian should bring democracy to them. But if Vespasian would rather just keep things the way that they are and rule as an emperor, in other words, to have a monarchy, that the people would obviously accept him and it would be fine. So Euphrates argues for democracy. Dio Chrysostom is in favor of he's more ambiguous, we'll say, in his opinion. He says either democracy or monarchy would be fine if you rock it right. And then you have Apollonius' speech, and it is no surprise that it is longer than the other two. Apollonius is of the opinion that monarchy is inevitable, so the question of getting rid of it is useless. Listen, guys, we are talking to a politician here, not a philosopher. A philosopher might be more inclined to consider overthrowing our entire government and changing the way that we've been doing things for idealistic reasons, but Vespasian is not a philosopher, he's a politician. There is no getting rid of the imperial system. He says, imagine stopping an athlete on his way to the Olympic Games and suggesting that once he wins the contest, he can't call himself the victor. No. Vespasian is going to defeat his enemies and become the emperor. We can't take that title away from him. And he says Vespasian also has 2 kids that have armies of their own, and they are going to be quite upset indeed if Vespasian does not leave them the empire as their inheritance, especially if he had that power and then gave it away. Apollonius says, I personally don't care about constitutions, which kind of government we should have, because I'm devoted to the gods. So this is not really my thing anyway. But he says, quote, but I do not like to see the human flock perish for want of a shepherd at once just and moderate. So for the Roman people as a whole, it's better for them if they have a monarch, provided that the monarch is good and just. And the implication is that Vespasian will be that kind of monarch. He says, quote, for just as a single man, preeminent in virtue, transforms a democracy into the guise of a government of a single man who is the best, so the government of one man, if it provides all round for the welfare of the community, is popular government. So for Apollonius, monarchy is not necessarily the absolute rule by one person if the values and priorities of that one person are in alignment with the highest good for the community. So it's not that monarchy is bad, it's just that you have the right kind of ruler to make it good. Then he challenges the other two by saying that, yeah, it's true that Vespasian was not there to overthrow Nero. He didn't participate in that revolution at all. But did you, Euphrates? Did you, Dio Chrysostom? Did I? He says no one blames philosophers or calls them cowardly for not overthrowing Nero. It's a philosopher's job to say what he thinks, not to take up arms. But for a politician like Vespasian to take up arms against a tyrant, there's a lot of moving parts. He has to deliberate. How is he going to do it? He has to gather a large group of friends. He has to get a lot of money so that he can pay off the rich and powerful so that they don't just turn around and overthrow him right away. So it's not really fair to criticize Vespasian for not doing that. He was otherwise embroiled in Judea. And Apollonius ends his speech with his final suggestion, which is to say that if Vespasian gets power and gives it up, he is going to make enemies of everyone who helped him get there. So we have these three arguments. Euphrates thinks that Vespasian should take power and then give it back to the people. On the other hand, you have Apollonius, who thinks that he should take power and keep it, and Chrysostom, who takes the middle approach. He should get power and then ask the people what they want him to do. Now, you will all be shocked to hear that Vespasian goes with Apollonius's proposal to take power and retain it. So then he asks Apollonius to describe what the qualities of a good king are. And Apollonius gives him a bunch of advice about how to rule effectively. So I'll just speed through these really quickly. He says, don't worry about money. Use your money to give aid to the poor, while at the same time keeping the rich happy by securing their wealth. Make yourself aware of your absolute power and fear it, so that you act in moderation. Rather than just punishing revolutionaries, you have to try and get rid of dissatisfaction in the people, and also make sure that they know that they'll be punished so that they're less likely to act. He says, respect the laws, respect the gods, separate your job from your personal life, and act accordingly in each arena. So when you're tending to the duties of the state, act as a sovereign, but in your personal life, act like a private citizen. He says, you don't need me to tell you not to drink and gamble, because you don't do that anyway. You're an upstanding guy. Then he says, keep your sons in line, because their actions will reflect on you, and make sure that they understand that their accession to the throne is a privilege from merit, not a right from inheritance. Rein in the vices of the people slowly and carefully, because it's hard to convert an entire people to wisdom and moderation, but something has to be done because the people are out of control. And finally, he gives some advice about provincial governors. Governors get their positions in one of two ways. Either they are appointed by the emperor, or they get their position by lot. So he says, for your appointed governors, they're going to be good no matter what because of your good judgment. But make sure that the other governors who get their position by lot are well disposed towards the provinces they govern. That is, the governor of Greece should speak Greek and things like that. They should be invested and take some time to understand the local culture and the local lifestyle so that they're better able to minister to the needs of their people. So Apollonius ends his speech of advice, and Euphrates speaks up and says, I agree with everything he just said. But he does make a little dig at Apollonius at the end. He says, quote, while you approve and countenance that philosophy which accords with nature, you should have nothing to do with that which affects a secret intercourse with the gods, for we are easily puffed up by the many absurdities this lying philosophy falsely ascribes to providence. So in other words, Euphrates is kind of accusing Apollonius of a little bit of charlatan philosophy here. He's like, you act like you have some special access to the gods and you don't. Now, in the context of the story, at least for Philostratus, it seems like Apollonius really does. But Euphrates takes issue with this kind of thing, and he calls Apollonius out, which seems to just make him look bad in front of Vespasian, to make Euphrates look bad in front of Vespasian. So Book 5 ends with all of these guys parting ways. Apollonius and Chrysostom leave off on good terms. Apollonius and Vespasian obviously leave on good terms. Euphrates not so much. Apollonius tells Vespasian that he's going to go to Ethiopia, which doesn't follow the modern borders of Ethiopia, but we get the sense in Book 6 that he's somewhere kind of near Egypt, because he wants to see the Nile, and he wants to spend some time with a group of sages there called the Gymnosophists. And as he's leaving, Vespasian offers Apollonius 10 gifts, which he immediately gives back to Dio and Euphrates. At the very end of Book 5, things take a little bit of a turn because Apollonius learns that Vespasian has taken certain freedoms away from the Greek provinces, and he sends Vespasian a very stern letter, actually 2 letters, complaining about the emperor's conduct. And they never meet again. But that is thrown in at the very end. The bulk of Apollonius's interactions with Vespasian are in the very beginning. And I think it's safe to say, even despite the little hiccup at the end, it's safe to say that Vespasian is generally regarded as a good emperor within the context of this text. And the reason for that is that Vespasian is interested in asking the advice of philosophers. Not just Apollonius, although obviously Apollonius is the best and everybody should listen to him, but also other philosophers, and he witnesses a philosophical debate and he makes his decision based on hearing the arguments of these different political philosophers. So on the whole, Vespasian is given a good report card in the story, and this will go a long way towards how Apollonius interacts with the rest of the Flavian dynasty. In other words, Vespasian's 2 sons, Titus and Domitian. Book 6 begins as promised with Apollonius visiting Ethiopia, but again, he's somewhere in or near Egypt, on another quest for wisdom. He picks up an Egyptian boy called Domitian, who guides them and leads them, Apollonius and his followers, to the home of the Gymnosophists, the so-called naked sages, who live and practice in this area. When they first get to the home of the Gymnosophists, they see a man wandering around the area, kind of like outside. And Domitian explains to the group that this man has accidentally killed someone and has come to the Gymnosophists to seek purification and expiation for this ritual impurity, but that the Gymnosophists refuse to purify him. And so this man has been hanging out on the grounds of the Gymnosophists' home for months now, trying to get absolution for his crime. Now, Apollonius sees this, and because he's Apollonius, he has some kind of extra knowledge about the situation, and he knows that the man that this guy killed, the victim of this murder, was the descendant of someone who, in generations past, had destroyed the homeland of the Gymnosophists. So this man, by killing this guy, even though he didn't mean it, and even though he didn't know necessarily that he was doing this, he did the Gymnosophists a favor, and it was kind of like retribution for that other guy's ancestors' past actions. All of this means to Apollonius that the death of this man was an expiation for the ancient offense, and therefore that his killer should be purified at once. And Apollonius himself offers to purify him. He says, quote, "As it is not allowed me by my religion to address one who is stained with blood, I would ask you, my good boy, Domitian, to encourage him, and tell him that he will at once be purged of guilt if he will come to the place where I am lodging." And so the man in question comes to Apollonius. Apollonius went through the rites over him, which Empedocles and Pythagoras prescribe for the purification of these kinds of offenses, and he tells the man to return home now that he is purified of his guilt. So this first impression of the Gymnosophists is not good. Apollonius is not really impressed with their lack of understanding about this suppliant and his situation. They should have purified him right away. And so Apollonius is not entirely sure that the Gymnosophists are as wise as he thought they were. And he says, quote, "You don't call men wise who refuse to purify him." When Apollonius meets the Gymnosophists, their relationship does not improve. He says, quote, "And in point of wisdom, they fall short of the Indians rather more than they excel the Egyptians." So we learn a little bit about them. They worship the Nile. They live in the open air and they wear no clothing. This is why they're called the Gymnosophists, the naked sages. They don't have any temples, although they do have a grove that they reserve for ceremonial things. And, to make matters worse, our friend Euphrates, from the end of Book 5, is starting his revenge tour on Apollonius for owning him with facts and logic in that debate. So he is humiliated in front of Vespasian. He will not stand for it. So he sent someone ahead of time to the Gymnosophists to trash Apollonius before Apollonius even got there, to say, basically, that Apollonius is a wizard. This is a derogatory kind of term. It's like a charlatan philosopher guy. And that Apollonius is full of himself, that he thinks that he is better than the Indian sages, that he claims to be able to control natural forces rather than worshipping them. So all of this slander comes to the Gymnosophists before Apollonius even gets there. Apollonius does not know this. And now, of course, when Apollonius shows up, he's not very impressed with the Gymnosophists either. So when they send a messenger to ask Apollonius why he wants to come and visit them, he says, quote, "I am not surprised indeed at their not yet knowing what I want, and what I am come here for, though the Indians never asked me these questions." So we have a situation brewing here. Now Damis and Domitian, so Apollonius's main man, and this Egyptian boy who has been guiding them, they figure out what's going on. They're talking to each other, and Domitian had heard that Euphrates' agent had come to slander Apollonius, and so he fills in Damis, and they try to figure out how they can fix this situation with some sneaky diplomacy. And they manage to get everybody together for a meeting. So Apollonius speaks primarily to the leader of the Gymnosophists, a guy called Thespesion. And Thespesion describes the Gymnosophist customs. So we've already seen a couple of them, but essentially the way that the Gymnosophists live, according to Thespesion, is that they are different from the Indian sages because they don't do wizardry. The Indian sages are more like they're doing like magic tricks almost. But Thespesion does get a tree to salute Apollonius as a display to show that they can do that kind of stuff, they just choose not to. As I've said, they reject clothing and housing because the earth is enough for them. They eat vegetarian diet and they abstain from all desires. Thespesion presents a contrast between the flowery, ostentatious wisdom of the Indian sages and the cold, hard truth that the Gymnosophists are after, and he tells Apollonius that he has a choice in how he wants to do his philosophy, the Indian way or the Gymnosophist way. Then Apollonius tells Thespesion his story. He talks about Pythagoras and how he chose the Indian sages because they lived very close to the sun, which makes them wiser. If you remember from the earlier videos in the series, Apollonius seems to worship the sun in particular. And he's a follower of the Pythagorean tradition. And then he defends the Indians because he's a huge fan of the Indian sages, and so he defends them to Thespesion. And he says, no, they're actually very wise. They're not wizards like you think. I don't know where you got that idea. They don't do that kind of crap. And then he turns on the Gymnosophists and lights into them. He says, your way of life is way too austere. You are living such an ascetic lifestyle that you are actually missing the point, because the gods themselves even appreciate a little bit of flair every now and again. After all, Apollo delivers his prophecies in verse. So you guys have to lighten up a whole bunch, because your way of doing things is not really the cold, hard truth. It's just denial, denial, denial for seemingly no purpose. Now, the Gymnosophists are very impressed with Apollonius, and they immediately change their tune and say, Apollonius, please teach us what you know. Tell us about the Indian sages. And yeah, we're ready to learn. And Apollonius is still a little bit bitter and a little bit sore about the way that they treated him. So then he starts complaining about all of their interactions up to this point, and this is when things start to come out about Euphrates and all of that. So Apollonius and the Gymnosophists are able to reconcile a little bit once the truth is all out there. So a bit of a rocky start for Apollonius and his new friends, but nevertheless, they are able to work it out, and so now they can move on to the actual purpose of Apollonius's visit, which is to do philosophy with these guys. And if you'll remember, I've been talking about how philosophy is done. It is done through dialogue and discussion. So Apollonius and the Gymnosophists have a series of discussions. Now, like with all of the other people that Apollonius meets, they talk about so many things that I'm not going to be able to cover all of their discussions in detail. So I'm going to pick just 2 topics that they talk about. They're kind of related to one another, and that is on a Spartan ritual and on the concept of justice. Thespesion wants to know about this Spartan ritual that involves whipping people, scourging people. He says this kind of sounds like a bad ritual. And so he asks Apollonius if this is something that they do to criminals. In other words, this is a form of punishment for criminals. And Apollonius says, no, this is something that everybody has done to them at one point in their lives. It's actually a lightened version of a Scythian custom where they used to perform human sacrifices to Artemis. Apparently, Artemis wants human blood on her altar, so by whipping people, scourging people, you can still make that sacrifice to Artemis without killing people. And Thespesion wonders if it wouldn't be better to just execute 1 or 2 people and sacrifice those people to Artemis rather than having everybody go through this crap. But Apollonius says, no, really what it is like a feat of strength for Spartan young men to show that they are brave and they can withstand this kind of horrible treatment. Thespesion says, it's too bad that the Spartans won't accept foreigners into their community, because this would have been something that they could just sacrifice a couple of foreigners every year, get their ritual done, and not have to sacrifice any Spartans. But Apollonius reminds him or explains to him that the reason that the Spartans don't accept foreigners into their community is because they want to keep their rights and their institutions pure. And that's why the Spartans don't have foreigners, which is why the Spartan youths are the ones that are getting whipped in the name of Artemis. So no foreigners allowed. But then Thespesion says, Artemis herself is a tradition that they adopted from the very barbaroi that they want to keep out, the very barbarians that they're trying to keep away from their pure institutions. Which is kind of an own on Apollonius, but then Thespesion follows it up really quickly. He says, hey man, look, we're arguing about sacred things. We could poke holes in pretty much any religious tradition, but it's probably impious to be engaging in this kind of conversation, so maybe we should just let it go. So the discussion on Sparta ends in a bit of a stalemate. It's interesting to me because it seems like Thespesion has proved Apollonius wrong on one thing, and then Philostratus moves the plot on immediately. He's like, we're not going to talk about that. The next conversation they have is on the concept of justice. Now, we have met this principle before when Apollonius was talking to the Indian sages. They gave the example of Minos and Tantalus to describe their unique view on what is truly just and what is not within the realm of justice. And Apollonius was impressed by the Indian sage's argument, and he adopted it for himself. So Thespesion has Apollonius open up. Tell us about the Indian sages first, what they think about justice, and if what they say is good, we'll just stop right there. But if I have an issue with what they say, then we can proceed with our debate. So Apollonius reiterates the Indians' position on justice, that justice is more than just not being unjust. So all the way back in Book 3, the leader of the Indian sages, Yarchus, says to Apollonius, "You seem to think that justice is the mere abstention from injustice." So that's the Indian sage's position. Thespesion seems to think that this is sound logic. Doing something, it's not enough to say that doing something is just not doing it, right? Courage is more than just not running away in the face of danger. It's actually going to face danger, right? Good sense is more than just avoiding nonsense. It's actually substantial on its own. And he says, you never see anyone giving awards to people because they didn't rob a temple or something like that. So there is a substance to justice and good behavior that it goes beyond just avoiding injustice. And, he continues, doing the right thing, being just, is not necessarily a guarantee of success. I mean, look at what they did to Socrates, right? He was executed for doing what we as philosophers would argue was the right thing to do. So sometimes judgment is unjust, and so the law is not the same thing as justice. And Thespesion closes his argument, quote, "It follows then, O Apollonius, that, rightly judged, it is not the man who abstains from injustice that is just, but the man who himself does what is just, and also influences others not to be unjust. And from such justice as his, there will spring up a crop of other virtues, especially those of the law court and the legislative chamber." And Apollonius agrees with this. So they all kind of come to this consensus that is in alignment with what the Indian sages were saying the whole time, is that justice is substantive of itself, and it constitutes spreading your own just actions to other people, inspiring them and helping them to live in a just way. And then by extension, the institutions of the state will follow, which I think is really great sound advice, by the way. This is not a video about my opinions, but that's my opinion. I think that's very nice. So Apollonius's time with the Gymnosophists is of a similar character to his time with the Indian sages. He learns a little bit about their order, how they live, what their values are, and then they are able to debate and discuss both abstract and concrete topics. So they're doing philosophy together. This is an opportunity also for Philostratus, as the author of the text, to present a number of philosophical ideas to his readers. Setting aside philosophical discourse for the moment, Book 6 brings us another emperor to contend with, the Emperor Titus. He is the biological son and heir of Vespasian, and he rules the empire for a few short years before his untimely death. We meet him in the story before he takes power, just like his father, right after he defeats the Jewish population at Jerusalem. So Vespasian had been campaigning against the Jews in Judea, and after he's done over, he basically puts Titus in charge of that once he moves on to become emperor. So Titus has just won that war. And the first thing we learn about him in this story is that for that victory he was offered a crown, but he refused it. So how do we think Apollonius is going to judge Titus based on this one act of refusing the crown? Quote, Apollonius sends greetings to Titus, the Roman general. Whereas you have refused to be proclaimed for success in war and for shedding the blood of your enemies, I myself assign to you the crown of temperance and moderation, because you thoroughly understand what deeds really merit a crown. Farewell. So, Apollonius and Titus become friends through letters, helped in part through Apollonius's affiliation with Vespasian, and after this victory, Titus becomes co-emperor with his father. And he expresses a little bit of concern about taking power so young. He's only 30. And Apollonius gives him some advice, although he does praise Titus for being so modest and humble. Apollonius also promises to send Titus his friend Demetrius, who is a Cynic philosopher. He just belongs to a different philosophical school. So he's going to send Demetrius to Titus as an advisor, as a guide. We've met Demetrius very briefly. We heard that he was openly disparaging Nero during Nero's reign, and so he got into some trouble along with other philosophers who were speaking out. So Demetrius is a friend of Apollonius. He's going to send him to Titus to advise him. And there's one more thing that Titus asks Apollonius. He's concerned for his life now that he's in such a position of power, and he wants Apollonius to help him figure out who he should be on guard against. And Apollonius gives him the following advice. He says, while your father is alive, you should fear his enemies. But when he's gone, you should fear your own family. Now, obviously, this is another instance where Apollonius knows something that the rest of us don't know. Then Titus asks Apollonius how he will die, and Apollonius says that he will die by sea. And we learn here that, at least according to Damis, this by sea is a reference to a kind of poisonous fish that Nero used to use to get rid of people, and that 2 years after Titus took over as the sole emperor, so after the death of Vespasian, Domitian, his brother, used it to poison him and take over as emperor himself. Now, let me be clear. This is not universally agreed on by the ancient sources. Not every source says that Domitian took power by poisoning his brother. It's true, Titus did die very young, and he was expected to rule for a long time, and he couldn't do it because he died. But a lot of the other sources say that he died from an illness or something else like that. Philostratus is taking the extra step here to say that Domitian had poisoned his brother. But as far as I know, this is not like a consensus among ancient authors. And that's how we meet Domitian. We hear that he has poisoned his brother. Now, we only get a little taste of Domitian's reign in Book 6. Books 7 and 8 are pretty much obsessed with Domitian, and so we'll cover him in great detail. But we just learn a couple of things about him here. We learn that he has passed 3 laws. Number 1, outlawing the practice of making men eunuchs, which, if you don't know what that is castration. And there's different reasons why that happens. That's a practice. So Domitian outlaws this practice. He outlaws the planting of new vineyards, and he cuts down existing vineyards. Now, Apollonius says that these laws don't affect him at all personally because he doesn't drink wine and he's not interested in having children. So nothing to do with castration or vineyards has anything to do with him personally. But he says, he makes a little witty comment about this. He says that Domitian is sparing humans while making the earth a eunuch. So he's not really impressed with that. And that's it for Domitian in Book 6. So we will return to Domitian at the start of Book 7. Now, the last episode in Book 6 that I want to mention is one of those times where Apollonius does something that is beyond the ordinary capabilities of a human being, beyond normal human capacity. While he is in Tarsus, Apollonius comes across a boy who has been bitten by a rabid dog and himself has become rabid. He has no idea who he is anymore. He can't tell them anything about where the dog is, what it looks like. He is afflicted by this condition. Now, of course, Apollonius knows what the dog looks like, where to find it, and so he sends Damis, poor Damis, to go and get this rabid dog and bring it to where the boy is. And then Apollonius declares that this boy has been possessed by the soul of Telephus of Mysia, and that the fates have declared the same thing for this boy as for Telephus. Telephus of Mysia is a minor character from Greek mythology. He's supposedly the son of Heracles who was raised by the royal family at Mysia. He fought against the Greeks in the Trojan War when they came to attack his city, and he was wounded by Achilles. The Mysians sought an oracle and determined that Achilles would have to be the one who healed him, because he had been the one who wounded him. And in fact, this came true. In Apollodorus' version, the rust from Achilles' spear is the healing agent of this wound that Telephus of Mysia has. So Apollonius makes reference to this myth, and he says that the cure has to be like that of Telephus of Mysia. And so when Damis comes back with the dog, Apollonius somehow or another gets the dog to lick the wound where he had originally bitten this boy. And the boy is healed. He comes back to himself. He recognizes his parents and all of that. Then Apollonius has the dog swim across a river, and by the time the dog comes to the other side, it stops its rabid behavior and it starts to drink the water, which is a sign that it has been healed of rabies. And this is how Philostratus chooses to end Book 6, with another instance of Apollonius grabbing onto this knowledge that other people don't have access to. How does he know that the boy is possessed by Telephus of Mysia? How does he know what the dog looks like or where to find it? How does he know that licking the wound is going to cure the boy of rabies? How does he know that he can get the dog to swim across the river and heal itself of rabies? Philostratus, of course, explains none of this to us. We're just supposed to accept that Apollonius has this kind of extraordinary capability that other people don't have. And so we have another instance of it here, where Apollonius does something that other people just simply cannot do. So we're at the end of Book 6. Everybody get up, stretch your legs, do your exercises. We have a lot of philosophy left to cover. So I'm going to take a break, and I will see you back here for Book 7. I am aware that the conduct of philosophers under despotism is the true touchstone of their character. Okay, folks, we have made it to the climax of the story. Books 7 and 8 are pretty much entirely dedicated to the conflict between Apollonius, champion of philosophy, and Domitian, the representative of tyranny, and in the context of the story, the all-time representative of tyranny. We've been building to this since the reign of Nero, beginning in Book 4. But the difference here is that Apollonius never met Nero, never interacted with him directly. He did come under some scrutiny that was easily avoided, but Apollonius's issue with Nero was primarily Nero's attitude towards philosophy and philosophers in general, not necessarily his problem with Apollonius himself. Just to recap, Nero had gone after philosophers because he believed that they were magicians or wizards of some kind who wanted to manipulate nature in a way that is unholy. So he set up legislation that made it illegal to practice or teach philosophy in the city of Rome, and he imprisoned philosophers like Apollonius's associate Musonius, who had been put to hard labor digging the Isthmus of Corinth, which was that vanity project that Apollonius knew Nero would never finish. And although Nero had put out a warrant for Apollonius's arrest, Apollonius wiggled out of it. Now, Domitian is the emperor after killing his brother Titus, but again, the sources are not 100% settled on this question. The Babylonian Talmud says that a fly flew up Titus's nose and picked at his brain until he died. So there's a lot of different theories going around. In the context of Philostratus's work, Domitian has killed his brother Titus, and he now sits on the throne as a usurper, and generally not a very nice guy. He is by far the most anti-philosophical emperor that Apollonius deals with. The beginning of Book 7, I read you the opening line, but the first few sections deal with how different philosophers acted in the face of tyranny. Everybody from Zeno to Plato and beyond. So I won't go through every example, although you can see a summary here on the screen. The main thing to take away from this preamble is, first, Philostratus walks through how each of these philosophers showed courage in the face of tyranny, refusing to succumb to pressure to stop practicing and preaching philosophy even when their lives were in danger. So that's first. Then, Philostratus explains how, even though these philosophers were brave and they did the right thing, the circumstances weren't nearly as bad as what Apollonius faced with Domitian, and so their actions are less admirable than what Apollonius does. Of course. Remember, Apollonius is the end-all be-all of philosophers. He is the philosopher of philosophers. Of course, because he is the best out there, everything that he does surpasses his predecessors. So what does Apollonius do during Domitian's reign? Unsurprisingly, we see him unwilling to back down under the pressure of this anti-intellectual emperor. We learn first a little bit about Domitian's character. Quote, "He took pleasure in the sufferings of others, and in any lamentations they uttered." During his reign, distrust is the best safeguard. He murdered a bunch of senators, and, quote, "Philosophy was reduced to cowering in a corner, to such an extent that some of its votaries disguised themselves by changing their dress, and ran away to take refuge among the western Celts, while others fled to the deserts of Libya and Scythia, and others again stooped to compose orations in which his crimes were palliated." Philosophers are faced with a choice in these tumultuous times. Do they back down, or do they face danger head-on? We encountered this in Book 4 when Apollonius meets up with a philosopher named Philostratus of Tyre. Apollonius and his crew are on their way into the city of Rome, and Philostratus is on his way out. He says things are getting bad in the city. You should probably get out of there. It's not safe for philosophers. And Apollonius, by refusing to listen to Philostratus' advice and by marching into the city with his followers, he is able to demonstrate to his followers that the courageous thing to do is to, in fact, go into the city and continue to practice philosophy as normal in defiance of the persecution against them. So we have the problem here again. Once again, things have gotten bad, and some philosophers have chosen to flee or simply to use their powers of speech and rhetoric and all of that just to praise Domitian in the hope that he will be favorably disposed towards them. And so they sanitize what he does. But Apollonius, as you probably could guess, does not do that. He continues to go around the city, trashing Domitian, consequences be damned. An incident that is of interest to me and of regular viewers of this channel has to do with the execution of 3 Vestal priestesses for the breaking of their vow of chastity. In the year 87 CE, 3 Vestals allegedly broke their vow of chastity, and Domitian had them executed. This was the normal punishment for this kind of offense in the Vestal priestesshood. So what Domitian does is still within the realm of what was considered normal. But of course, it's hard to say whether they actually broke their vows, or if they were used as scapegoats. Now, I could go on forever about the use of Vestals as scapegoats, essentially to make the population feel better in uncertain times. All of your problems are because this priestess broke her vow of chastity, and the goddess Vesta is mad at us, and so we have to execute her in order to satisfy the anger of the goddess, and once we do that, all of your problems will be solved. Now, that's a separate issue, but in any case, Domitian has these 3 Vestals executed, and Apollonius actually reacts to this. So in response to these murders, he says, quote, "O son, would that thou couldst too be purified of the unjust murders with which the whole world is now filled." So clearly he disagrees with Domitian's judgment in this case. So whether or not these Vestals actually broke their vow, it's unclear, at least in this text. There are other sources for this incident, but I'm not going to get into it. But in any case, Apollonius is speaking out here again against something that Domitian does. It's just worth pointing out because of the Vestal connection and her importance on our channel, and because it shows Apollonius not caring about moderating his opinion about Domitian's actions. But Apollonius goes even further than this. Now, it's ambiguous, but it may be the case that Apollonius helped a senator named Nerva in some kind of plot against Domitian in order to take over the throne. Now, students of Roman history might know the story like this. After the death of Domitian, the Senate decided to appoint Nerva as the new emperor because he was old, and because he was agreeable to almost everybody. He wouldn't try to diminish the power of the Senate. He was in favor of the Senate. And all of this came in response to Domitian's death, which was unrelated, because the Senate wanted to avoid another power struggle like the one that took place after Nero's death. But in the life of Apollonius of Tyana, Nerva's accession may have been in the works. There may have been a plan to put Nerva on the throne while Domitian was still alive. And if this plot was real, that Apollonius may have taken part in it. We know that Apollonius is in contact with Nerva and with Nerva's people. They're corresponding in letters, and Apollonius is giving Nerva advice. But he does this with lots of people, so that's not necessarily an indication that he is plotting revolution. But Apollonius does know that it is risky to correspond with Nerva because Domitian seems to be aware of Nerva's intentions, and so Domitian had Nerva settled outside of Rome. He basically got rid of Nerva by saying, why don't you go and move outside of the city just to get Nerva away from him. And so it's kind of dangerous to be an associate of Nerva at this time. But we also learn that Apollonius knew ahead of time, of course, that Nerva would become the emperor. And he gave a speech to this effect. He was a little bit vague with it, but he said that no one can escape fate, even and especially tyrants, and that even if Domitian had the fated next emperor killed, that guy would come to life once again. He doesn't name drop Nerva, but he gives this speech about fate, and he says if the current emperor killed the guy that was fated to become emperor next, that guy would just come back to life because he's fated to become the emperor. So Apollonius is not hiding his opinions at all. And because he is not hiding his opinions, it's only a matter of time before he gets on Domitian's radar. This speech that he gave, the one that I was just talking about fate, is reported back to Domitian by none other than our friend Euphrates, who comes back again to be a thorn in Apollonius' side. Euphrates gives a report to Domitian, says Apollonius has been saying the following things about you, and this gives Domitian the pretense that he needs and an opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So it's much easier for Domitian to arrest Apollonius and implicate him in the plot, supposedly with Nerva, to overthrow Domitian and put Nerva on the throne. It's a lot easier for him to implicate Apollonius in that than Nerva. Nerva has all these powerful friends. He's a very powerful politician, a senator. He's got lots of money. He's got lots of friends. Apollonius is just kind of a regular citizen who is a philosopher, so there's already legislation against philosophers, and he stands kind of outside of the matrix of power. If Domitian can get Apollonius as an accomplice of Nerva and can prosecute him as an accomplice of Nerva, then Domitian has the pretense he needs to go after Nerva directly. Knowing that he's a wanted man, Apollonius does not back down. This whole time, he has been outside of the city of Rome. He's practicing and preaching, traveling around the empire, still within the bounds of Domitian's sway, but not in the city of Rome itself. But once he comes to understand that Domitian is coming for him directly, he decides that he's going to move towards the city rather than away from it in order to meet this particular danger head on. His first stop on his way to the city is to visit the home of Demetrius the Cynic. This is the same guy that Apollonius had made an advisor of Titus. So he's an old friend of Apollonius. He is a philosopher. He's a Cynic philosopher. And he has been staying outside the city of Rome in the old villa of Cicero. The subject of Cicero's house and its significance is a can of worms that I don't have time to get into, but if you know anything about Cicero and his political activities, it's probably significant that this is the location of a meeting between anti-establishment philosophers. So Apollonius and Damis meet up with Demetrius at Cicero's old house, and they discuss the situation at hand. Apollonius is wanted by Domitian on trumped-up charges of conspiracy, which may or may not be false. So what should Apollonius do? What is the moral, ethical, philosophically sound thing to do when faced with such danger? Once again, we have the question, what should philosophers do in the face of tyranny? This debate follows the same tradition as we've been seeing periodically throughout the text. Debate and dialogue is the primary vehicle for truth. A question is posed, and each contender presents their best arguments. In the end, the most reasonable argument is chosen. And once again, as we have seen, sometimes the content of the discussion is theoretical or hypothetical. But in this instance, the discussion is very real because the consequences are very real. By the end of this debate, Apollonius will make his decision. Does he continue on into the city of Rome to face his accuser and whatever the consequences may be, or does he try and run away? Now, you can probably guess what he's going to do just based on the way things have been going throughout the text, but we'll go through this debate anyway. Another thing that I want to point out is Damis's participation in this debate. When we first met Damis, he was struggling with simple logical reasoning and philosophical inquiry. He had been following Apollonius, learning from Apollonius. Apollonius was teaching him about philosophy, both how to do philosophy, how to have dialogue and debate, and about how to see the world as a philosopher sees the world and live the life that a philosopher lives. And throughout their travels together, we saw several instances where Apollonius got invited to something and Damis was not allowed to participate because he wasn't there yet in his journey. Sometimes the narrative drops out because Philostratus is using Damis as a resource, and Damis was not invited to hear the conversations that Apollonius had with kings and rulers and philosophers, that Damis just simply was not invited to. Now that we're near the end of the story, Damis not only gets to hear this very important discussion, but to participate in it, and his contributions are valued by Apollonius and Demetrius. At this point in the story, we could say that Damis has become a full-fledged philosopher, and he's treated by Apollonius and Demetrius almost as an equal. Now, this debate is long, and like everything else, I'm going to have to leave a lot of things out, but here is a brief summary of the arguments. Apollonius asks Demetrius if he would run away under the same circumstances. Demetrius says no. If he were going to be put to a fair trial, he would not run away, he would stay. But there are no fair trials these days. Demetrius says that it's better for a philosopher to die for a cause, that is, say, to liberate his city or to protect his family and friends. But to die for nonsensical reasons, and to give a tyrant an excuse or make a tyrant look wise, is not a good thing for philosophers to do. And he says you'll also be putting your friends in danger if you go down, right? If Domitian gets Apollonius, he's going to go after Apollonius's friends. Demetrius says, you're in a good spot right now, you could easily escape, and I think that you should. So the first speech is Demetrius's speech, and he argues that it doesn't make any sense for Apollonius to die in this case, which certainly would be the punishment for treason, right? It doesn't make sense for Apollonius to die for this cause because it's not a fair trial. He's not really winning any moral or philosophical victories, and he's going to put other people in danger. It's probably best for him to just avoid this whole situation. Damis is the next to speak, and he opens his speech by saying, well, this is the first I'm hearing of any trial, of any arrest. I followed Apollonius here because I follow him everywhere. I had no idea that this was happening, but since I'm here, let me give you my opinion. He says, if I were to die, it wouldn't hurt philosophy very much because I'm just a little guy, right? I'm not a significant player. I'm not like this great teacher, right? I'm just somebody who likes philosophy. But if Apollonius dies, then that's effectively the end of philosophy because he is its most powerful representative on Earth. Apollonius embodies philosophy, and so to get rid of Apollonius is to defeat philosophy once and for all. And he says, you're right, Demetrius, that after Apollonius dies, of course, informants will be coming for all of us, and so we're all gonna die. And he says, quote, I admit that one ought to die in the cause of philosophy, in the sense of dying for one's temples, one's own walls, and one's sepulchres, for there are many famous heroes who have embraced death in order to save and protect such interests as those. But I pray that neither I myself may die in order to bring about the ruin of philosophy, and that no one else either may die for such an object who loves philosophy and loves Apollonius. So Damis' speech essentially just reiterates what Demetrius said. It doesn't make any sense for you to martyr yourself for this cause because it's not a good enough cause. You are not going to be able to acquit yourself because it's not a real trial. All of your friends are going to die. Philosophy's going to go down with you. It sounds like a bad idea and you shouldn't do it. After hearing these two arguments, Apollonius gives his opinion, and he begins with kind of a rude comment about Damis. He says, Demetrius, you will have to forgive the cowardice of Damis' speech because he comes from a place that doesn't really know freedom. Remember, he picked up Damis in Nineveh. His argument is that Damis doesn't really get the democratic spirit, we'll say, because he didn't grow up with it. Not very nice. And he says, but you, Demetrius, you have no excuse because you grew up here and you know what it's like to be free. So you should know better about being a coward in the face of tyranny. Then he says, those causes that you listed, that people die for, their friends, their family, their freedom, it's natural and anyone, philosopher or not, would do it. but it's up to the philosopher to die for his ideals. So there's an additional responsibility for philosophers, not just to protect their lives and their families and their homes and their freedom and all of the things that anybody would go down for. But beyond that, a philosopher has to stick up for his ideals even if it means his death. He continues on and says, I know everything, and I know that I'm not actually in danger. I do know that I'm risking the lives of my associates, but if I betray them by cowering in the face of tyranny, that would be even worse. And even if I were to escape, as you suggest, and all my friends are murdered, where could I go? How could I pray for safe passage after that? How could I ask my friends abroad to harbor me, Phraotes, Thespesion, Iarchus? How could I ask my friends abroad to harbor me after I'd given up everything that I've ever stood for? Do you think that Phraotes, Thespesion, Iarchus would take me in after that, after I gave up my ideals and let all my friends die? He says, quote, I will not betray even myself, but I will boldly wrestle with the tyrant, hailing him with the words of the noble Homer, Ares is as much my friend as thine. There was no way that Apollonius was going to run away. Nothing that Demetrius or Damis could have said would have convinced Apollonius in this moment that running away from this challenge was the right thing to do. And even if you disregard the part where he says that I know everything and I know that this is not actually going to result in my death, if you just dismiss that, it's still the right thing for him to do, to go and face Domitian in this way. And this is what he settles on. And surprise, surprise, he convinces Demetrius and Damis that it is the right thing to do. And now it's time for full-fledged philosopher Damis to get his brave moment. Quote, But Apollonius looked at Damis and said, If you are firmly resolved and as courageous as myself, let us both embark upon the ship. But if you are dispirited, it is better for you to remain here, for you can live with Demetrius during the interval, since he is as much your friend as mine. But Damis took him up and said, What could I think of myself, if after you have so nobly discoursed today about the duty of sharing the dangers of one's friends when they fall upon them, and I let your words fall on deaf ears and abandoned you in the hour of danger? And this, although until now I have never shown cowardice where you are concerned. So Damis makes the decision to go with Apollonius into the city, knowing that he is going to get put in prison just like Apollonius and knowing that his life is in danger. So once he makes that decision, he and Apollonius set out for Rome. Really quickly, let's look at the charges that are leveled against Apollonius. We get them kind of throughout the end of Book 7 and into Book 8, but I want to bring them up here just because Apollonius learns the full list before he turns himself in and is arrested. The charges are: 1. His style of dress and way of living. 2. The fact that he is worshipped by some people. 3. That he delivered an oracle at Ephesus. This is in reference to the plague of Ephesus, which we talked about at the end of the last video in Book 4. Number 4, public and private speech against the emperor. And number 5, a conspiracy with Nerva that involved Apollonius performing a human sacrifice. So this is what Apollonius is accused of doing, and he, again, knows all of this and learns all of these charges before he turns himself in willingly. Once he does that, he is arrested and he and Damis are sent to prison. They will be in prison until the time of Apollonius's trial, which is Book 8, so we'll hear his full defense against these charges there. But while they are in prison, Apollonius interacts with the other prisoners who are there. Their conversations demonstrate the effect that Domitian's reign has had on the empire. So, one man has been imprisoned because he inherited a large area of land, and informers told Domitian that he got it by acting somehow against the emperor. But the real charge is, of course, that Domitian wants this guy's land. Another guy is imprisoned because he forgot to mention in a prayer that Domitian was the son of Athena, despite the fact that Athena is a virgin goddess, and so her having a son doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this guy was imprisoned for not saying that Domitian was the son of Athena in a prayer that he was giving to Athena. So it goes on like this. Apollonius meets a number of prisoners who have been imprisoned for all of these kind of trumped up charges, and it shows the kind of justice system that exists during the reign of Domitian and how he is weaponizing the justice system in order to advance his own personal agenda. As Apollonius hears their testimony, he tries to comfort them. The main goal of philosophy is to find happiness and peace through truth and understanding and the right way of living. And so here we have an example of philosophy ministering to those in need. In this moment, Apollonius acts almost like a spiritual advisor to dispense the wisdom of philosophy and to help the prisoners feel better and be able to better bear their situation. He encourages them to go into the trial ready to defend themselves, because it's the best thing that they can do in their situation. If they believe that their cause is just, yes, the trial is likely not going to go their way because the system itself is broken, but they have control over their own conduct in that moment, and they can represent themselves well, even if things don't go their way. And in the meantime, he gives some advice about how to deal with the discomfort of being in prison. He says, quote, "We men are in a prison all the time, which we choose to call life. For this soul of ours, being bound and fettered in a perishable body, has to endure many things, and be the slave of all the affections which visit humanity. And the men who first invented a dwelling seem to me not to have known that they were only surrounding their kind in a fresh prison. For, to tell you the truth, all those who inhabit palaces and have established themselves securely in them are, I consider, in closer bonds in them than any whom they may throw into bonds. And when I think of cities and walls, it seems to me that these are common prisons, so that the merchants are in chains no less than the members of the assembly, and the frequenters also of spectacles, as well as those who organize public processions. Then there are the Scythians who go about upon wagons. They are just as much in chains as ourselves, for rivers like the Ister and the Thermodon and the Tanais hem them in, and they're very difficult to cross, except when they are hard frozen. And they fix up their houses on wagons, and they imagine that they are driving about, when they are merely cowering in them. And if you don't think it's too silly a thing to say, there are those who teach that the ocean also encompasses the earth in order to chain it in. Come, O ye poets, for this is your domain. Recite your rhapsodies to this despondent crowd, and tell them how Cronos was once put in bonds by the wiles of Zeus, and Ares, the most warlike of gods, was first enchained in heaven by Hephaestus, and later upon earth by the sons of Aloeus. When we think of these things, and reflect on the many wise and blessed men who have been thrown into prison by wanton mobs, or insulted by despots, let us accept our fate with resignation, that we may not be found inferior to those who have accepted the same before us." Because Apollonius, as a Pythagorean philosopher, believes in the reincarnation of the soul, to him, the body is a prison, homes are prison, all geographical features that you can't cross are prisons. Everyone is in prison all the time. So if you're feeling bad about the fact that you're in prison, just understand that you're not alone, and that all of the greatest men before you were thrown in prison by somebody else. Even the gods themselves throw each other into prison. So this is how Apollonius is comforting his fellow prisoners as he waits for an audience with Domitian. and that audience comes before the trial. So Apollonius is summoned to meet with Domitian privately before the trial even happens. So here we have it, the first meeting between Domitian and Apollonius face to face. Now, the actual content of this meeting is kind of anticlimactic in a way because it's not the kind of big trial that we will get in Book 8. But in this initial interaction, we see how these two react to each other when they first meet. And Domitian's first reaction to Apollonius is to be startled and to say that Apollonius is some kind of demon. I'm assuming the word here is daimon. I didn't go back and look. So he thinks that Apollonius is some kind of non-human entity. And Apollonius, in his usual way, says, "I thought that you worshipped Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Well, she doesn't seem to be helping you very much if you're still confusing men with demons." He literally cannot help himself. But this is part of it, right? He has to show up and not moderate his speech or behavior just based on the fact that Domitian is very powerful. Immediately, Domitian demands that Apollonius defend himself for the charge of conspiracy with Nerva. And Apollonius says, "Look, I think Nerva's a great guy. I have corresponded with him. I think he's got a good head on his shoulders. I like talking to him. Yeah, he's an alright guy." Apollonius doesn't say anything about the conspiracy. He doesn't directly refute it. He doesn't admit to it. He just kind of defends Nerva's character and moves on. Now, at the end of this meeting, Domitian has his people take Apollonius and cut his hair. This is the outward sign of a philosopher. You wear your hair long, you walk around barefoot, yelling at people on the side of the road. So, in cutting Apollonius's hair, Domitian is almost disrobing him as a philosopher or separating him from the outward appearance of a philosopher. It's a way of humiliating him, it's a way of separating him from his nature, and so this is the last thing that Domitian does before sending Apollonius back to prison to await the trial. The last thing we need to talk about in Book 7 is something that I am calling the miracle of the chains. I know this is a loaded title, I am choosing it intentionally, so just hear me out on this. After the audience with Domitian, Apollonius goes back to prison and meets up with Damis, who is in a miserable state, especially after he sees what they did to Apollonius. And he asks Apollonius, "What's gonna happen to us? Are we toast? Are we done for?" And Apollonius once again assures Damis that they will not be killed. This is hard for Damis to accept, right? They are in prison. They are up against the Emperor Domitian. He is killing people left and right, and he's imprisoning all of these people for no good reason. Almost certainly they will be executed. This sounds like a pretty bad situation, and Damis is having a hard time accepting that just because Apollonius says everything is going to be fine, is it really going to be fine? Apollonius insists that he will be set free, and he says, "In fact, I am already free." And at that moment, he takes his foot out of the shackle that it is in, and shows Damis that the shackle wasn't actually holding him there. And he puts his foot back in the shackle, and winks at Damis, and says, "I told you, we are going to be fine." He says, quote, "Here is proof positive to you of my freedom, to cheer you up." Well, isn't that something? Philostratus says, quote, "Damis says that it was then for the first time that he really and truly understood the nature of Apollonius, to wit that it was divine and superhuman, for without sacrifice, and how in prison could he have offered any, and without a single prayer, without even a word, he quietly laughed at the fetters and then inserted his leg in them afresh and behaved like a prisoner once more." So here, at what seems to be their lowest point, we get the most direct and obvious display of Apollonius's true nature. Even though Damis already believed that Apollonius was beyond a normal person, there is no doubt at this point what Apollonius truly is. Although what he is hard to put into words. Is he a god? Is he a daimon? Is he just a guy with magic powers? Was he a wizard the whole time and we all were just fooled? It's hard to describe it, but it goes without saying that there is something so different with this guy. And here we are at this critical hour. Everything seems lost, and now we get just a little taste of what is to come, with Apollonius doing something that might indicate to us that there is some way out of this mess. Book 8 is a little bit different from the others in that it is not entirely chronological. In the beginning, we have the day of the trial, the events leading up to the trial, and then the trial proceedings. And they're covered very quickly. Domitian asks Apollonius several questions that follow along the charges that we've already discussed. Apollonius answers each one briefly, and the trial ends. But then we learn from Philostratus that Apollonius had prepared a very long speech for the trial that he did not end up using. And then Philostratus produces the speech in full, and it takes up a big chunk of Book 8. I think the reason that he does it this way is to use this speech as a teaching tool, because he has been showing us how to do philosophy the whole time. Dialogue is one of the main vehicles for philosophy. It's one of the ways that truth and wisdom gets dispensed, but another way is the speech. Right? Think about Socrates' apology that we get in the writing of Plato. The apologia, which is not actually an apology in the modern sense, but a defense speech when Socrates is put on trial. If I'm Philostratus, I want to hear Apollonius' full defense speech as well. Now, we've seen Apollonius' charges already, but let's take a second to dissect them a little bit. Most of the charges have to do with Apollonius' lifestyle and his character. To live as a philosopher has been criminalized, so we see accusations about his dress and his hair. Now, philosophy has been lumped together with other more explicitly supernatural activities like divination and magic. Domitian doesn't want rogue prophets wandering around. So Apollonius is made to answer for predicting the plague at Ephesus. This is one of the charges: you gave a prophecy at Ephesus. How could Apollonius have come to know that a plague was coming if not for practicing evil magic? Maybe one of the most important accusations is that people describe Apollonius as a god, and we've seen already in the text some quasi-worship of him at certain points. Part of the reason why this is such a dangerous accusation is that Roman religion has changed in the imperial era. Since the reign of Augustus, state religion has made room for a new, very powerful cult. That is, the imperial cult. The emperors are believed to be divine, or at least deified upon their death. Domitian, according to some of our written sources, has been experimenting with the imperial cult, like Caligula did before him. Caligula went around and started calling himself a living god. He was doing kind of like an Egyptian pharaoh thing where the people worship the leader. Domitian is experimenting as well. He is now having people call him, again according to our written sources, Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. So the idea that the people could be worshipping another living person is a threat to Domitian's religious authority. But all of these are auxiliary charges, because the real charge is that Apollonius has helped Nerva in a plot to overthrow Domitian and install himself on the throne. And we've seen that Apollonius may in fact be guilty of this charge, regardless of Nerva's actual ambitions. And again, if Domitian can prove that Apollonius helped Nerva engage in treason, he will have a concrete reason to arrest and get rid of Nerva. This is the real heart of why Apollonius is on trial, is for this purpose and this purpose alone. All of the other stuff is ancillary to the real meat and potatoes. So like I said, we get a very brief back and forth between Domitian and Apollonius during the trial, where Domitian, who is presiding over the trial, because of course he is, asks Apollonius a question about each of the charges, and Apollonius answers very briefly. So Domitian asks, "What induces you to dress differently or to wear the things that you wear?" Apollonius says, "Because the earth provides, and because I leave animals alone." Remember, Apollonius is kind of a proto-vegan. He doesn't eat meat, but he also doesn't wear animal products. So this is his answer for Domitian. Domitian asks, "Why do people call you a god?" Apollonius says, "People always call good men gods. I'm a good man, there's a little bit of God in all of us, etc., etc." Domitian asks, "What made you predict the plague at Ephesus?" Apollonius' answer for this one is great. He says, "Well, I eat a really light diet, so sometimes I can sense things that other people don't sense because they're weighed down by the stuff that they eat. I don't eat very much, so I can I can tell when things are coming. If you want, I can list all of the scientific causes of plagues and, the way that you could predict them." Domitian's like, "No thanks." And then with the last charge, Domitian asks, "So, you sacrificed a boy. Who did you sacrifice this boy for?" Apollonius says, "Well, if I did sacrifice a boy, I'm gonna have to see some witnesses." After this exchange, everyone, including Domitian, is very impressed with how Apollonius owned everybody with facts and logic. And so Domitian really has no answer for Apollonius's defense. So he just acquits Apollonius of all charges and says to him, "Why don't you hang back after the trial so that we can talk more?" But Apollonius has no intention of staying for a private audience with Domitian. So instead, this is what Philostratus says. Quote, "Accord me also," this is Apollonius speaking, "accord me also, if you will, opportunity to speak. But if not, then send someone to take my body, for my soul you cannot take. Nay, you cannot even take my body. For thou shalt not slay me, since I tell thee, I am not mortal." And with these words, he vanished from the court, which was the best thing he could do under the circumstances. When Apollonius says, "For thou shalt not slay me, since I tell thee I am not mortal," this is a quote from Homer's Iliad in Book 22, and it's something that Apollo says. This is kind of interesting just because Apollo is a sun god and Apollonius has a special affiliation with the sun and he worships the sun, so I find it particularly salient that he's quoting Apollo here, but yeah, he just disappears from the court. Now, I went back to the Greek and I looked at this because I wanted to know exactly what Philostratus said when he said that he disappeared from the court. So, bear with me for a second, we're getting into philology. The word is aphanisthe, the third singular aorist passive indicative of aphanidzo, which has a lot of definitions. In the active, it means to make unseen, to hide, make away with, conceal, suppress, do away with, remove, disappear, destroy, obliterate, spirit away, secrete, seal, obscure. But in the passive, it just means to disappear or to be missing or to be absent. So this doesn't really help me very much at all. Like I said, after this, Philostratus cuts the action, says, "Pause. We're doing 30 pages of a speech." So I will not be covering the speech in detail. Are you sick of me saying that yet? But I do want to mention just a couple of points that I think are relevant, both for the speech itself as a piece of literature and for the plot and what we know about Apollonius. So first, Apollonius calls Vespasian as a witness in his speech. This is a classic rhetorical tactic to call upon someone who is not there as a witness, to directly address someone who is not there. Vespasian is dead, but Vespasian is also Domitian's father, and Apollonius was friends with Domitian's father. So he appeals to Vespasian to this end. He says, quote, "Let us then appeal in this matter to one whom I deny to be dead, although the many assert it. I mean your own father, who held me in the same esteem in which you behold him, for he made you, and was in turn made by me." Now, he says he doesn't believe that Vespasian is dead. This is either because he believes in the immortality of the soul, or because, according to imperial cult, when emperors die, unless they were exceptionally terrible, they are deified. That's not really my point in bringing this up. This is just a classic rhetorical tactic. I think this falls under the umbrella of apostrophe. I think that's the title of this particular tactic, but I'm not 100% sure, so please correct me if you know more about that kind of thing. So Apollonius appeals to Vespasian as an authority, especially as somebody who Domitian loved and respected while he was alive. And he says that Vespasian approved of his lifestyle and behavior, of Apollonius's lifestyle and behavior, and that he asked Apollonius for advice, even meeting with him in a temple. Now, do you think that someone as smart as your father would have met me in a temple if I really was a charlatan wizard? I don't think so. Alright, next, we opened this video, if you can remember that far back, with a quote from this speech that I will read again now. Quote, "The various arts known to mankind, in spite of the differences of their functions and achievements, are yet all concerned to make money, some earning less, some earning more, and some just enough to live upon. And not only the base mechanic arts, but of the rest, those which are esteemed liberal arts, as well as those which only border upon being liberal. And true philosophy is the only exception." In this speech, Apollonius takes the opportunity to defend philosophy by saying that philosophy is the only art, is the only skill, is the only discipline that people come to for its own sake. You can't make any money being a philosopher, at least if you're a real philosopher. Now, you can be a fake philosopher and just suck up to power, but that's not me. I don't have any money, and I consider myself one of the richest people in the world. Philosophy exists outside of social considerations, and its only aim is to make the lives of its seekers better, and by extension, the lives of those around them. It is something that is taught for its own sake, with the only goal being making everybody's lives better. And the idea here is that philosophy doesn't have to be an enemy of the emperors or the imperial system. In fact, if you remember when he was talking to Vespasian, he actually argued in favor of keeping the emperors. For Apollonius, philosophy doesn't need to concern itself with politics, and he says as much later in the speech. He says, I never really concerned myself with imperial happenings apart from when I was giving your father and brother advice. And this is part of his defense against the charge of conspiring with Nerva. He says, what could Nerva have offered me? I clearly don't care about money. So what was it that I would have benefited by helping Nerva? And, my concern is elsewhere. I am interested in religion. I am interested in doing philosophy all day long as I do and teaching other people to do it. He says, but if you want to see what sucking up to power as a philosopher looks like and all of the benefits, the worldly material things that you can get as a fake philosopher, look no further than your friend Euphrates, who happens to be standing there in the room during the trial. He says, look at the exalted position that Euphrates is in. He claims to be a philosopher, but he's really a suck-up. So yes, in addition to defending philosophy, he takes down Euphrates. I'm just going to read this in full, because we're already 75 hours into this video anyway. He says, quote, "And yet, if you want to know how much a philosopher may obtain by flattery of the mighty, you have only got to look at the case of Euphrates. For why do I speak of his having got mere money out of them? Why, he has perfect fountains of wealth. And already at the banks he discusses prices as a merchant might, or a huckster, a tax-gatherer, a low money-changer. For all these roles are his, if there is anything to buy or sell. And he clings like a limpet to the doors of the mighty, and you see him standing at them more regularly than any doorkeeper. Indeed, he has often been shut away by the doorkeepers as greedy dogs are. But he never yet bestowed a farthing upon any philosopher, but he walls up all his wealth within his own house, only supporting this Egyptian out of the money of others." This is like another guy that Euphrates has brought into the trial. "And whetting against me a tongue which ought to have been cut out. However, I will leave Euphrates to yourself, for unless you approve of flatterers, you will find the fellow worse than I depict him." He's giving Domitian the benefit of the doubt. He's like, listen, you don't like flattery, right? Look at that guy. Now, Domitian loves flattery, and that's why Euphrates is in the position that he's in. But I digress. And a little while later, he returns to the subject of Euphrates and says, quote, "But since I do not think I ought altogether to pass by the slanders of Euphrates, I would ask you, my prince, to judge between us, and decide which of us is more a philosopher. Well then, whereas he strains every nerve to tell lies about myself, I disdain to do the like about him. And whereas he looks upon you as a despot, I regard you as a constitutional ruler. And while he puts the sword into your hand for use against me, I merely supply you with an argument." There's so much good stuff in this speech that we could just spend video after video analyzing it in and of itself. But I just wanted to bring up a couple of points. The address to Vespasian, the total takedown of Euphrates, and the most important, the defense of philosophy. He has been defending philosophy for the entire biography, but here, in its most critical moment, he defends it well, I think, and thoroughly, directly to its opponent. And by the way, giving his opponent an opportunity to join him, rather than just saying, philosophy is better than you. He says philosophy is good, and you can have it too. There's a difference there. And at the end of the very long speech that Philostratus writes out for us, he closes once again with the quote from the Iliad, "I am not mortal." And so the two timelines kind of converge back together at this point. The confrontation between Domitian and Apollonius marks the climax of the story. But after the trial is over and Apollonius vanishes from court, the biography continues with the aftermath of the trial and then the rest of Apollonius's life. Before we pick up, though, we have to backtrack just a little bit to the end of Book 7. Right before Apollonius goes to meet Domitian and have this trial, he has one final conversation with Damis, and he sends Damis away. Now, Damis is just in prison as Apollonius's companion, so when Apollonius goes to court, it seems like Damis is free to go. So Apollonius sends Damis away back to Demetrius. And he tells him, quote, "And when you have saluted Demetrius, turn aside to the seashore, where the island of Calypso lies, for there you shall see me appear to you." "Alive?" asked Damis, "or how?" Apollonius with a smile replied, "As I myself believe, alive, but as you will believe, risen from the dead." Some of you will have your wheels turning at this point. Damis expects that Apollonius will be executed because 1. Domitian is a tyrant who doesn't care about justice, and 2. It is politically expedient for Domitian to implicate Apollonius in the plot with Nerva. But of course, Apollonius is not executed, and he returns to Damis exactly as he promised that he would. Damis and Demetrius are hanging out watching the seashore as Apollonius had instructed, although they are not convinced that anything is going to happen. And this is where they're sitting. I'm going to read this part to you in full. Quote, "Damis's grief had just broken out afresh, and he had made some such exclamation as the following: 'Shall we ever behold, O ye gods, our noble and good companion?' When Apollonius, who had heard him, for as a matter of fact he was already present in the chamber of the nymphs, answered, 'Ye shall see him, nay, ye have already seen him.' 'Alive?' said Demetrius, 'for if you are dead, we have anyhow never ceased to lament you.' Hereupon Apollonius stretched out his hand and said, 'Take hold of me, and if I evade you, then I am indeed a ghost come to you from the realm of Persephone, such as the gods of the underworld reveal to those who are dejected with much mourning. But if I resist your touch, then you shall persuade Damis also that I am both alive and that I have not abandoned my body.' They were no longer able to disbelieve, but rose up and threw themselves on his neck and kissed him. So this is how Apollonius reveals to his friends that he is alive and well. And this is accompanied by Demetrius explaining to Apollonius that their other friend Telesinus had had a prophetic dream that Apollonius was going to be okay, and then nobody believed him, but now they all believe him. So once again, we have left the realm of the normal. Now we know that Apollonius has not died and risen from the dead. But the effect on his followers is almost like that. We learn later in Book 8 that Domitian has been assassinated at Rome. Apollonius experiences this as a vision while he's giving a speech in Ephesus, and he stops in the middle of his speech to kind of narrate what he's seeing, and he makes the announcement to the Ephesians that Domitian has been assassinated. And at first, understandably, the Ephesians don't believe him. Apollonius even says, "Look, I know you probably don't believe me, that's fine, nothing against you. There's going to be a messenger that is going to confirm what I say." And in fact, the messenger comes and then everybody believes him. What I find interesting about the end of Domitian is that it's almost an afterthought. Philostratus does describe the assassin and the fight that breaks out between him and Domitian, but there's very little fanfare. You know, considering that Domitian is the arch-villain of the story, it's just interesting to me that his death is told in such a roundabout way. Although it's really not surprising that the main emphasis is on Apollonius and his both understanding of what happened and his reaction to it. You just get the sense that the tyrant dies in obscurity. Now, I know that he didn't die in obscurity, he died as emperor, but in the text he dies and, nothing happens. After Domitian dies, Nerva becomes the emperor, which Apollonius knew ahead of time, and which we as students of Roman history knew ahead of time. And Apollonius appoints Damis as an advisor to Nerva. So for the first time, Apollonius and Damis will not be traveling together. Damis has reached the point of full-fledged philosopher, right? He has finished his training, he has participated in debates, he has faced evil head-on as much as he could in his circumstances, and now he's able to go on and be the advisor of the next emperor. So Apollonius sets him up in a really good place. But this means this is where they part company, and so Philostratus says that Damis's account of Apollonius's life ends here. And so the rest of the biography, Philostratus has to piece together from other sources. At some point after Apollonius and Damis part company, Apollonius reaches his end. I say reaches his end rather than dies. There are several accounts that describe what happened to him, and none of them agree. So very briefly, some say he died at Ephesus. Some say he disappeared into the temple of Athena at Lindus. Some say that he visited the temple of Dictina at Crete, which is guarded by dogs. And when the dogs don't attack him, the priests there accuse Apollonius of being a wizard and they arrest him. He escapes and he runs into the temple, where a chorus is heard singing about Apollonius going up into the sky. In summary, quote, "No one ventured to dispute that he was immortal." Philostratus says, "And even after his death, he continued to preach that the soul is immortal." Now, what form this preaching took, I have no idea. This is another one of those times where we just have to accept what Philostratus says. He continued to preach after his death, whatever that means. Now, it seems like a group of young philosophers or students of philosophy come and set up shop at Tyana, and they put together a little group where they're practicing philosophy and they're having discussions. And Philostratus also says that there was a shrine to Apollonius in Tyana. So here at the very end, the very last episode we're going to cover, a young man comes to Tyana to join this group of young philosophers, and he says that he doesn't believe that the soul is immortal, because he has been asking Apollonius, praying to Apollonius to appear to him and prove to him that the soul is immortal. But Apollonius has not arrived. A few days later, during his stay at Tyana, Apollonius appears to the young man in a dream, as if he is present among this man and his friends, and is delivering lectures on the immortality of the soul. And he cries out, "I believe thee." And after a few concluding remarks, that ends the biography of Apollonius of Tyana. Wow, friends, it has been a journey. I want to thank you all for your patience, both in the length of this video. If you're still here watching this, thank you so much for that. And also for your patience in how long it takes me to put out these videos. It's a massive, massive, massive text, a massive topic, and I wanted to do it at least some justice, so I really took my time with this one. And I hope that it was useful to you. I hope that it made sense and gave you things to think about. I'm going to try and summarize my main takeaways from this text as quickly as possible. The first, obviously, is the subject of philosophy versus tyranny. This is the thread that we've been following, but I do think it is the main purpose of this text. If you could say that the text has one purpose, I think it's multi-purpose, but for me, Philostratus is using the biography of Apollonius to show the advantages of studying philosophy and living like a philosopher does. Philostratus is himself philosophically trained, as most upper-class Romans would have been, and so he is not only personally invested in it, but he also believes in it. In particular, this thread of Pythagoreanism, which is Apollonius's chosen strain of philosophy. So I think a big reason why the text even exists is to show how advantageous it is to take on this discipline and to study it and really live it to its fullest extent. And this seems to be where Apollonius's powers come from. With the exception of the end of the text, which, God, we could go on all day about the end of this text. With the exception of that, most of what Apollonius does is figure stuff out ahead of time and know stuff ahead of time because he's exceptionally holy, because he lives in the right way. In other words, he's not a wizard. Philostratus has been saying this the whole time. Apollonius is not a wizard. He is not a charlatan. He's not faking it. There's no sleight of hand. He just is able to do things that are beyond the capabilities of a normal human being. And the reason he is able to do that is because he has devoted his entire life to the study and practice of philosophy. One of the main purposes of philosophy is to combat tyranny. We see leaders who are good and leaders who are bad. We see leaders who are doing things that are for the advantage of their people, and leaders who are using their position of power for their own personal gain, who abuse their position. And the difference between the two is that the one group is open to philosophy and the other group is closed to philosophy. And as I said, another thread that runs throughout the text is the notion that Apollonius is a quasi-divine figure. It's never stated outright that he's a god. That would not be possible, I think, to write. But he is different, and people notice, and some people kind of worship him. This kind of wandering mystic who stands outside of society, who gives advice and preaches wisdom, who is in favor of the existing religious infrastructure but wants to correct it and make sure that it is as proper and holy as it can be, Apollonius is not the only one of these figures. I might get in trouble for saying this, but there is another one who is really similar to Apollonius. Now, I'm not saying anything about anything, but let's get into it for just half a second here. Apollonius of Tyana and Jesus of Nazareth. Both of them are long-haired, barefoot hippies who wander around the places in the Roman Empire that they have access to and preach how to live a good life. They are not there to disrupt the existing religious infrastructure, but to correct it and make it more holy. Both of them can do things that ordinary people cannot, things that we might call miracles, including, but not limited to, raising people from the dead. Both of them get into trouble with the establishment because, for among other things, it is unclear whether or not people are worshipping them. And if they are worshipping them, that is a threat to not only the religious establishment, but to the political establishment, which in the case of the Roman emperors is one and the same. As a reminder, all emperors also hold the title of Pontifex Maximus, which is essentially the Pope of Roman paganism. Both of them face the legal consequences of their coming into conflict with the establishment. In both cases, the punishment is death. Now, Apollonius wiggles out of it, but we're not going to talk about that. And a few days later, both of them appear to their followers and have to convince their followers that they are in fact alive. And once they convince their followers that they are alive, their followers truly understand that they are more than human. And in both cases, there is some guy who doubts them and is made to believe. So again, I'm not saying anything about anything. I'm really not trying to disparage anybody's beliefs. That is really, truly not my purpose. But one of the most famous parts of Apollonius of Tyana is that people read this story and they see Jesus Christ. So that is why, right? Is because of all of those similarities. I'm not going to analyze that. I'm not going to say what this says about anything. But that is why people group these two guys together. And something that I have been wanting to do, something that I think is interesting, that I want to look into more, is other figures like this. Pythagoras would be the next one. The model for Apollonius, because Pythagoras supposedly had some kind of more than human stuff going on. And if there are others that you know about, please let me know, because I would love to get into that a little bit. So those are my main takeaways from this text. Please tell me yours in the comments. I would love to get discussion going. What do you think of this story? What do you think of anything that I said, or anything that you noticed while you were reading it, or anything that you know about Apollonius that I didn't mention? I would love to hear all about that. And so we have now gotten to the end of the biography, but I have one more trick up my sleeve, because there is one more video on Apollonius that is going to be coming out next time. And it's not going to be like the other videos, because I'm so excited to tell you that I will be interviewing a guest on this topic. I am so beyond excited. I'm not going to tell you too much about the guest now. You will meet him next time, but he is an expert in Roman history and especially political philosophy, and he specializes in the time period when Philostratus was writing, so during the time when this text was composed. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. So we're going to talk about Philostratus. We're going to talk about Julia Domna, who commissioned this piece to be written. She's the reason why we have it in the first place. And Philostratus is also the reason, so we'll talk about them. We'll talk about politics during this period of the empire and philosophy and what it meant to study and practice philosophy during the Severan age. So I am beyond excited to bring that episode to you. I am going to try to get that one out by the end of May. We'll see. So stay tuned for that. If you don't want to miss it, make sure that you are subscribed. And with that, I think I have to wind this video down. So thank you so much for your patience and for watching this. I really hope that you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed making it. If you liked it, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up. And as I've already said, I cannot wait to see all of your comments on this subject. So thank you so much, and I will see you next time.